Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Gretchen Wilkins. I'm the head of the architecture program here at Cranbrook Academy of Art. Tonight we have Geoff Manaugh, who is visiting us from Los Angeles, so a few hours ahead of him in timing. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have this as our last lecture of the series for the spring. And it is finally feeling like spring here in Michigan, so we're very excited about that and feeling a bit more free. Geoff Manaugh, who many of you will know, is a Los Angeles-based freelance writer. I came to know Geoff years ago, through, not personally, but through your work, through the fantastic blog called Building Blog, which was then made into a book, which we've been reading this semester here, in 2009, which is dedicated, the blog and the book being dedicated to architectural conjecture, urban speculation, and landscape futures. Geoff's work regularly covers issues related to cities, design, crime, infrastructure, and technology, and has been published in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The New Scientist, Cabinet Magazine, The Daily Beast, Wired, US and UK, among many others. He's also the author of, which I also have here, the Burglar's Guide to the City, which we love, which was a New York Times bestseller, and I was amazing to see it and interested to see it's being optioned for television by CBS. I'll look forward to that. Several of Geoff's writings have found their way into TV and film through Sony, through Netflix. We'll be excited to see those. This year he has another book coming out called Until Proven Safe: The History and Future of Quarantine, written with Nicola Twiley, which explores 600 years of architecture, suspicion, isolation, and uncertainty. And we might hear a bit about that today. So we will, after the talk, we hopefully will have time for a bit of Q&A. If you want to type your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, I'll help moderate that. And we can ask the questions and have a discussion after that. So until then, please sit tight and welcome Geoff Manaugh to Cranbrook. Thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and for hosting. It's great to finally meet you, Gretchen, after being in touch over the internet. So it's nice to put a face to a name. And thanks as well to Zofia and Mike in the background, who are helping to make sure this goes smoothly as well. Yeah, thanks for tuning in. I will be talking primarily about three larger research or journalistic projects that I've worked on over the last couple of years. I won't be doing all that much talking about Building Blog itself. And I should also note that if you have gone to buildingblog.com at all over the last 12 months, there have not been a lot of new posts. So sorry about that. It's become very slow, but between lockdown and finishing up the quarantine book, blogging kind of fell by the wayside while I was getting that project out of the way. So with any luck, that will change, and new posts will start appearing there at some point this summer, spring or summer. And then also then Until Proven Safe, which is that quarantine book, is coming out. It comes out on July 20th. I won't be doing too much talking about that today, but if there are things that you would like to discuss, by all means, feel free to drop that in the chat. And at the end of this talk, which I'm imagining will be roughly an hour, we'll do a brief Q&A. So if there's anything that you want to discuss, whether it's quarantine related, whether it's about Building Blog, or whether it's about any of the topics that I've brought up in the lecture itself, by all means, please feel free to drop those in, and we can do a conversation. Then with no further ado, I'm going to focus on three main topics, and I'm going to do them in a slightly different order than the title implies. So I'm actually going to begin with earthquakes, move into burglary, and then end up in invisible cities. We will understand exactly what all those terms mean when we get to them. And so with that, I'll just go ahead and jump in. Okay, no, I won't. Let me get back here to get to the right. Here we go. Okay. So this first section of the talk is called Walker Lane, and I'll explain what the Walker Lane is shortly. So I've been very, very interested in terrestrial conditions and how architects deal with them, both technically in terms of design and materials, but also conceptually in terms of thinking through it philosophically or metaphorically. A really interesting example of what I mean by that is the work of the late architect Lebbeus Woods. Levius was known primarily as a conceptual architect, a kind of paper architect, someone who did more writing and drawing, even painting, than he did do in model building, than he did do actual built architectural work. But regardless of that, the topics that he focused on primarily dealt with extreme conditions of extreme instability. So he often looked at things like war zones and cities destroyed by combat. He would look at earthquake zones and entire landscapes threatened from below by tectonic energy or tectonic instability, and divided cities, cities in which politics, the human condition, so to speak, and terrestrial forces all kind of worked against one another to create a condition in which humans were stuck in a very precarious position. And architecture for Levius, and something that I've always found very exciting about his work, was that architecture was, in a sense, the way to address those questions. It was a way to find ground in a world that wanted to reject the notion of solidity or of dependency or of something that we can trust. There's just something that really attracts me to that, the idea that the world at any given moment may betray us, at any year, any day, maybe even any minute now, because I live in Los Angeles and there could be an earthquake while we're engaged in this conversation with one another. But at any second, the things that you trust and that you think are there for you, including the ground itself, may turn out to be flimsy or untrustworthy. And how are you going to deal with that? That's generally a question for philosophers, but in Levius's case, that was a question for architects. And there's just something about that again, it really draws me to his work, and led to some of the, or helped inspire rather, some of the investigations that I'm now going to discuss in terms of earthquakes and architecture. So you'll notice from this image, which is from a work of his set in the San Francisco Bay Area that looked at earthquakes in the city of San Francisco, resembles to a certain extent these satellite views of the San Andreas Fault. I will be giving a kind of a potted history of plate tectonics and geology in this talk. So if you're a tectonic geologist, you maybe have your your eyes maybe widening at the prospect of cramming that into a talk. But it also just would be the very general things that you need to know for the purposes of this lecture. So the San Andreas Fault is, if you don't know it, it's about an 800-mile long gash in the earth. It's where the Pacific tectonic plate meets the North American tectonic plate, and they're grinding past one another very, very slowly. And when they get stuck, the forces build up between them. And then when the forces are released and there's a lurch in the plates, that's an earthquake. Those can be very, very small and almost continuous, where there's just constant tiny little tremors that is just one plate kind of rumbling past the other. Or they can be huge. They can be very, very large ones, including the mythic big one that will allegedly strike California at some point in the future and cause untold devastation. That's the fantasy that gets made into disaster films. There was a particularly egregious example of that actually called San Andreas, in which the wrestler formerly known as The Rock is a helicopter pilot, and he rescues his family from a devastating earthquake along the San Andreas Fault. But the San Andreas Fault represents for me a really nice encapsulation of these ideas of a kind of, it's where two worlds come together, the Pacific world and the North American world. It's where there are landscape effects of this, and it's a place that you can actually visit and explore. If you go there, as I did at one point many years ago on an extended trip where I spent about 2 weeks traveling north along the San Andreas Fault by myself, you can actually find little signposts as if this is a tourist site, a kind of tectonic tourism or earthquake tourism. And this is where you are heading west along a little bridge. You're near a town called Parkfield, where you're actually crossing onto the Pacific plate, leaving the North American plate behind. It's actually worth pointing out, and I'll get to this later, but Parkfield, the town where this photograph was taken near, is on a section of the fault where the ground is so soft down below. There's a lot of talcum and other very soft minerals in the ground there, that it creeps rather than lurches. And so instead of having these very large earthquakes that might be known elsewhere along the fault, instead it's just a very slow process of drift. That means that there's actually a bridge in fact, I think you can see, if you look in the lower left, you can see part of the railings of this bridge. But the bridge is actually torquing out of alignment because it actually straddles this gap between worlds. And there's just something incredible about this sort of like a staple or a suture or a moment of connection that is actually being deformed by the very ground that it's built on. And that's a theme that we'll come back to later when we look at the architectural effects of these strange terrestrial processes. But so what drew me to this, among many other things, was that thinking geologically, and these are sections cut down into the earth, is all but identical to thinking architecturally. And this is just a representative image. It's not specifically connected to the San Andreas material that we're discussing. But so what I wanted to do many years ago was actually take this material and say, if we can take geological sections, and if we can take this idea of two things tectonically colliding, you may already be recognizing, if you're an architecture student or an architect, these are terms that come up all the time in your own discipline. So what if we were to take these ways of thinking about the earth as a layered, disjunctive, moving tectonic realm, and actually approach it architecturally, and actually look at the way in which an architect and architectural thinking, because if there's one thing that I think architects are, well, there are many things that I think architects are good at, but one of the things that I think architects are good at is giving visual representation and volumetric representation to extremely complex spatial scenarios. And what could be more complex, was my thinking at the time for this, than something like the San Andreas Fault, and treating that as a kind of architectonic structure, an 800-mile long architectonic structure in the earth that could be explored by architecture students. And so I put together a course. Actually, hold on, I have one more picture to show this. Oh yeah, so this is just one of my favorite things ever. These are called fault trenches. It's where you actually dig a trench into a fault in the earth. In this case, this is the San Andreas, or at least my memory of this article is that this is the San Andreas. But you cut down into the earth, and then you install these stabilizing beams to help hold the walls up so that you don't get buried alive while you're down in there. And then you look very carefully at the stratigraphy and the disjunctions in that stratigraphy to see, what is colliding down there, the giant car crash of the Earth's surface, what has happened, how old is it, has it eroded over time, are there breakages within breakages that might signify earthquakes on top of previous earthquake damage, et cetera. But this to me just looks like a Lebbeus Woods-like architectonic fantasy that you could carve a trench into the earth and reveal its section, reveal its stratigraphy, and actually momentarily stabilize it as a work of architecture. It's landscape art meets avant-garde architecture, meets geology, all in one sort of project. And so it's this kind of stuff that I'm talking about when I'm saying that you can think about geology and tectonics from an architectural point of view, and of course vice versa. And so what I wanted to do, and what kicks off this first part of the talk, was looking at the architectural possibility of a San Andreas Fault National Park. So this was the premise of a class I taught at Columbia GSAP with some first-year graduate students, where the idea was for them to choose a site along the San Andreas Fault, which, if you are unfamiliar with the geography of California, this is a map of California. The red line that you see going here, that is the San Andreas Fault. Los Angeles is down here, and this is the Bay Area, San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And so the San Andreas Fault goes right through San Francisco and Silicon Valley. It just narrowly avoids Los Angeles. And the premise was choose a site and then build the infrastructure necessary for a national park. That's a very, maybe sounds like a very mundane, no pun intended, design brief, but the idea was to look at a lot of things, one of which was the concept of preservation that's associated with a national park. What does it mean to preserve politically, and even in terms of landscape architecture? What does it mean to preserve a landscape that is in the process of, is always on the verge of radical change? At any given moment, the land inside your park might be subject to a 9.0 earthquake, resulting in huge amounts of shifting and damage. So what does it mean that is in the center of something that is subject to historical preservation or of natural preservation protocols from the U.S. government? But also, what does it mean to attract people to a place where they may be endangered? What is the line between what are the ethics of that to actually construct a facility or a place that says, hey, come visit, come see this astonishing landscape that is always on the verge of a great shift, only you might die there. It seemed like an interesting ethical challenge to approach, and at least in terms of conversations and what this kind of park might entail. But then finally, I just thought it would be interesting to look at the idea of enshrining in the national narrative, actually making it a part of the US national park infrastructure, a site like the San Andreas, where two worlds are coming together to collide, where again, abrupt change is always imminent. It's always a threat. It's always a possibility. It's always a promise, depending on how you look at it. And are there interesting metaphoric or political takeaways you could take from that suddenly becoming part of the national narrative, the national memory? So I just wanted to show very briefly, because obviously there's way too much to get into, but just what some of the interesting modeling that came out of the course. These were primarily executed by a student named Ricky Vega, who was really fun to work with. But the idea was to say, okay, if the San Andreas Fault could be volumetrically extruded and mapped and turned into a, quote, structure, what would it look like? And so using data that the students found from the USGS, which is the United States Geological Survey, they were able to piece together these models that Ricky then modeled, or rendered, I should say. And so it's interesting to me that some of these forms, look very much like sort of today's, or maybe the 2010s kind of parametric architecture. If you had told me that this was an art center in Shenzhen designed by Zaha Hadid or Patrick Schumacher, I might actually believe you. It turns out actually this is the San Andreas Fault being modeled over, I can't remember the scale actually, I want to say about a mile. This is another one. This is actually closer to that town that we started at, where the bridge is that's being warped. This is Parkfield, and this is Watsonville. And so again, my point here is simply to show that architects already think spatially and already render spatially and are extremely good at giving visual representation to these kinds of things. And so why not sort of sick them, so to speak, on geological data? And could you get geologists and architects to team up on their representations and actually have some really exciting thing come out of that? Because after all, when you look at the fault, such as this road cut, this is actually another famous site. If you're a sort of a wonkish geology person like myself, this is a site of tourism. It is this, or at least when I was there, it was not signed. There's no actual indication that you are where you are if you're a geologist. So there is yet, there's a kind of absent earthquake tourism infrastructure that I would be really interesting to develop. In any case, this is the San Andreas Fault, or it's very near the San Andreas Fault by a couple hundred feet, just north of Los Angeles as you go into a town called Palmdale. And so if you park your car and you do some minor trespassing, you can end up here and take a photograph. And you can see what is so astonishing to me, at least to me, about this landscape, is that you have these massive forces, the size of continents, literally, coming together and grinding past one another relentlessly and slowly and unstoppably. And they create spatial conditions that look sort of like this, where it's like two waves crashing together. You've got the layers on the right here that have all but gone, instead of being layered flat, the way sediment piles up, it's been turned vertically. You've got these amazing sort of curls that almost resemble a kind of a wave striking the shore. And and the scale is pretty astonishing. So this is a freeway down there. And this is, if you can see that, that's actually a street lamp. So you're probably talking about 90 feet, 85 to 90 feet of vertical gain. But so these things are just hidden in the landscape. And often we don't know they're there until we do a landscape cut and reveal them. In fact, this reminds me very sort of generically of this very famous Japanese woodcut of a Hokusai's wave that shows this kind of tidal wave crashing ashore. I love the idea that the San Andreas Fault is a kind of tidal wave in rock, and that you can explore and visualize it. So there's much more that I could go into about the actual class, as you can imagine. There's quite a lot happens over the course of a semester, especially when you've got 11 or 12 students, each developing independent projects. But in the interest of time, I'm going to go just kind of fast forward the reel here and continue the discussing of tectonics and earthquakes, but just move on a little bit. And then, if you have questions about the student work or the nature of the class, that's the kind of thing that we can come back to. So in any case, so this is part of the San Andreas Fault. This is seen from above. You saw an earlier version of this, a different version of this earlier. This is what it looks like from satellite view. But there are other parts of the fault that when you get there on the ground, it's not nearly as spectacular. So many years ago, I wanted to actually go out and kind of ground truth this. You know, if this is what the fault looks like from space, I wanted to know what it looks like beneath my feet. And so I pieced together this trip that I mentioned where I spent a couple weeks going up the fault, and I spoke to some geologists and some tectonicists, and they gave me the advice of, if I'm going to go to this one span of the fault, which is known as Wallace Creek, it's about halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles, I should go there either at sunrise or at sunset. It wasn't just because, you know, they're poetically minded and they thought it would be a kind of like, you know, a symbolic or romantic time to be there. But it was because of the conditions of the light and what the light would reveal in the structure of the earth. And so I'm not a morning person, so I headed there at sunset, or actually, as you can see, a little bit before sunset, where this stretch of the fault is effectively just a wide open plain. It's kind of a featureless plain with the exception of these mountains in the background and some low hills over to the left of this photograph. So if you were just there and you didn't know what was happening, you may even be a little underwhelmed. You know, it's a little anticlimactic to drive many hours into the middle of nowhere, and then this is what you get out of the car to see. So again, I was there alone. I had some time to kill. And if you look at the ground, you might notice something. There's lots of tiny little divots and holes. And it turned out that very briefly, I didn't realize this until I made it to my hotel this night, and I looked up what was happening. But I was there in the middle of a tarantula boom. I guess this was the tarantula breeding season. And so there were just unbelievable amounts of tarantulas that were coming out of the earth and looking for each other. And I happened to be there alone at sunset when a lot of them were coming out of the ground. So if you do go in the month of October, try to find out if there's a tarantula boom happening so that you can try to avoid this kind of Raiders of the Lost Ark style fate. Luckily, nothing happened, but it was quite a surprise to realize that the ground around me was moving, and it was not the shadows; it was the tarantulas. In any case, okay, so the sun is now setting in the west, and you can. I hope you can start to see what's happening. The vegetation is casting longer shadows, but that shadow that is emerging there, that diagonal line, is revealing the presence of the San Andreas Fault. So there's just enough of a difference in elevation in the ground that as the sun goes down, this black line starts appearing in the landscape. And all of a sudden, as if out of nowhere, you're looking at this straight black line that just goes for miles and miles and miles down the landscape, down this kind of valley. And this, ironically, will actually come up later in the third part of this talk when we're looking at archaeology and the use of shadows and an aerial view to reveal the presence of something hidden inside the surface of the earth. So again, metaphorically, but also architecturally, I think and from a landscape point of view, what draws me to this is this idea that what you're looking at appears featureless, it appears empty, or it appears flat, but in the right conditions and at the right time, structure is revealed. And in this case, it's not just structure, it's the interface between two worlds. It's a place where you can walk from the Pacific plate to the North American plate and back again. It's a place where you can straddle the danger of where that might slip or cause an earthquake. And it bears not only scientific interest, but at least for me, like immense metaphoric and poetic interest in exploring this kind of place. And of course, a really great setting for architectural speculation and the kinds of projects that might thrive in a constantly moving landscape like this, that is more akin to a kind of slow sea than it is a solid earth. So again, I'm going to keep kind of fast forwarding here, and before I get to the Walker Lane part of this, but briefly, I wanted to show what the implications of this are on an urban and architectural scale. There is a town, well, there's two places that I went to on the same trip. This is in Hayward. Hayward is south of San Francisco. It's near Silicon Valley. It's on an offshoot of the San Andreas system. So it's on this thing called the Hayward Fault. The Hayward Fault is what goes through Berkeley in the chance that you're from the West Coast. But what was incredible actually is that the Hayward is on a section of the fault that is also constantly creeping and moving. And there was a intersection in the city of Hayward where the curbs were drifting. And so this photograph north is to the right. And so the red curb is actually the west curb. And the curb that is right below where you can actually see the tip of my shoe, that's actually the east side. And so incredibly, everything west of that curb is drifting north, and everything on the east side is, for all intents and purposes, stationary. And you can actually see that geologists had been coming and giving field trips to their students and actually using Sharpie to indicate and date where the curb was at any given point when they actually came to visit. So this curb actually became a kind of sign system for seeing how much the Earth had shifted over a given amount of time. You can see the dates written there. You can see the arrows that kind of match between the west and the east side. And you can even see it's a pretty dramatic shift. This has been moving along at a relatively carefree pace for decades, and will continue to do so for the known future. Tragically, the street crew for the city of Hayward, I guess, was unaware of this curb's legendary status amongst geologists. And they actually came along one day, a couple years after I wrote about this, and took these photographs. And they just tore up the sidewalk and the curb. And now we're back to zero. But at least theoretically, you'll be able to go here in maybe 10 years from now. So set your calendar now, and see if the curb has drifted, and if the Earth has moved beneath and pulled the city slowly apart. So this was another example of a kind of tectonic a site people would go to in terms of earthquake tourism. So briefly then, another even more interesting case, I think, actually is a town called Hollister. Hollister is actually south of Hayward. It's a little bit closer to Parkfield, but it's also on a part of the San Andreas. It's on an offshoot of the San Andreas Fault system, but it's one of the ones where the ground is so soft that everything is just drifting very, very slowly. It's called creeping. But so you can actually see this incredibly in satellite view on Google Maps. You can see this line of deformation that goes through the center of town, where everything west of that line is moving north. And it's so relentless, but also so slow, that if you look at this house carefully enough, you'll notice that it's slow. It's just slightly torqued out of alignment. So it was built, as a rectilinear cube, and it's slowly becoming a kind of parallelogram, because the west side of this house is being pulled north by the ground beneath the city. The city is kind of a slow ocean, and the west part of it is drifting. This actually has formed landforms throughout the city. There's actually a berm that has formed in a local park. And one of the things I love about just the vernacular encounter with the marvelous is that you would think that this berm would be a site of poetry and astonishment. It's a deviation in the Earth's surface that indicates huge terrestrial forces at work. But instead, it's actually just a popular place to sunbathe, because you can lean your back up against it, and you may not even know what's causing it or what formed it, but you can get a great tan. So you never know how incredible landscape forms will be used in everyday life. But this is another nearby house, and this will be the last example from this town. But if you look carefully at this image, there's not much to see, but notice the curb. Okay, so this is unbelievable. This walk used to be centered on the house, but the fault line, and you can see this on a satellite view of the map of the city, the fault goes right in front of this house, which means that the house is, again, it's locally stationary. For all intents and purposes, it's not moving. But the front yard, the curb, the road, where I'm standing to take this photo, and even its own front walk is drifting north. So, the implication is that if you don't fix this, but you come back in 15 years, the curb, or maybe 25 years, this sidewalk is just going to go, directly into the pillar, like some sort of, avant-garde, experimental Eisenman kind of project. So again, it's these tiny little symptoms or signs of very large shifts elsewhere that I think are quite interesting. And even a town that looks as architecturally uninteresting as Hollister, no offense to Hollister, actually has hidden beneath the surface, drifting and slow mutation and changes that would otherwise be invisible. And it's the architecture in this case that actually makes those changes visible, and that I think is worth noting here. The house itself is like an instrument for revealing terrestrial change, which again is a kind of Lebbeus-Woodsian premise and would be worth exploring further. Imagine if someone with that in mind actually designed something in the city of Hollister, and what it could reveal and what it could do. I think that would be an exciting design project. Okay, so I've gone into the San Andreas Fault at great length, and I will just wrap up the first part of this lecture by saying my mind was totally blown around, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I learned that the San Andreas Fault, which you can see here as the green dotted line, which was the red line that we saw in that student map for the GSAP studio, that's the San Andreas Fault. But then this red line is this thing called the Walker Lane. So I was absolutely blown away to realize that for most of my life, this thing, the San Andreas Fault that I thought was, this poetic interface between worlds, is potentially going to be dwarfed by this thing, the Walker Lane. So there's way too much to get into to go into the specifics here. So the very fast version of this is that the green line is a continuation of the same thing that ripped open the Gulf of California. But you will notice here that that it is no longer a straight line, that if you were just to follow this, you would think it would go up through the Central Valley like that. However, it deviates north of Los Angeles, and that's called the Big Bend. So there's a big bend in the San Andreas Fault. So there's a growing cohort of geologists who think that the Big Bend might actually be a kind of fatal flaw in the San Andreas Fault's evolution. And that it may in fact be dying out. So rather than being the superfault that represents the end of North America and the beginning of the Pacific world, instead it's just going to die out over time. And all of that strain that's building up, because the Earth is still moving, the plates are still grinding against one another, the strain has to be let go somewhere, and that will be out here in the desert in a place called Walker Lane. So for a feature article for Wired 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of actually being able to go out into the Walker Lane district, tectonic district, with a geologist named Jim Folds at the University of Nevada, Reno, and drive way out into the backcountry and actually visit sites where these faults, there are hundreds of little faults that his theory is that his hypothesis is that they're going to effectively connect up over time. And then something like the San Andreas Fault, and like those satellite images I showed, where you can actually see a linear feature in the landscape that represents this disruption. The Walker Lane area will become that, but on a much larger scale. So one of the ways this was discovered, that Walker Lane was discovered, was through a technology I'll briefly describe called GPS geodesy. This is just a representative image that I pulled to kind of show how this works. But GPS geodesy works by attaching a GPS monitor to a tripod-like structure that is mounted into bedrock, so that it can't just move in the soil, or if there's frost on the ground or a heavy rainstorm, the tripod's not going to move because it's anchored to quote unquote solid ground. And then from space with the GPS satellites, they're measuring the movement of the GPS point that's on the top of that tripod. So that doesn't sound particularly exciting, but when you take the data over long spans of time, 10 to 30 years, you actually discover that there are movements happening everywhere in what we think is solid ground, or what we think is stationary. So if you look at this image, that's what these arrows are. The arrows represent movements that are invisible to the human eye, but are picked up by GPS geodesy. So you can see a couple things here. First of all, this is the Walker Lane, this kind of heavy band here with the red lines. And you can see the movement coming up out of the Gulf of California. This is the San Andreas, which is still obviously very active. But over time, the idea is that activity will migrate inland. But I just want you to look really quickly, if you can see this, at the direction of these arrows. You begin to realize that there are weird movements like vortices and circular tides and these kinds of currents inside the ground that are the way that the Earth is moving at the moment, with the huge tectonic plates bashing into one another and grinding against each other. And it's this Lebbeus-Woodsian idea, I think, that what we want to believe is solid and is permanent or ancient may be ancient, but it's also moving. It's more as if we live on an ice floe than that we live on solid ground or anything terrestrial as such. We live on an ocean planet. Even the parts of it made of rock follow ocean mechanics. I just compare this briefly here to an image from an Edgar Allan Poe story, Descent into the Maelstrom. But we're standing atop a terrestrial maelstrom, and it's being revealed scientifically, but it has immense interest poetically narratively and even architecturally, and certainly philosophically. And it would be really, I think, interesting to look at the ways in which these kinds of breakthroughs and understandings in the way the landscape is moving do in fact figure into maybe emerging schools of philosophy or architectural thinking as well. I think there's only a couple more slides. Yeah. So in terms of the Walker Lane, I'll just wrap up this section of the talk by saying that these are the kinds of landscapes way out in the boonies that we drove out to see. This is a drone photograph. You can see the truck that comes out to and parks to go look at the fault. I don't know if you can see this, but this is one of these emerging tectonic features out there that someday theoretically will all line up and form the super fault of the Walker Lane. But it's this dark line that cuts across the landscape. And this will come up again in the third section of my talk today. But one of the ways that you can see faults is, first of all, from above, but second of all, because there are these really subtle changes in the ground that are otherwise not easy to see. And in this case, if there's a change in vegetation, it might mean that the ground has been, is easier to take root in. And so plants with deeper roots can grow in that area and form a visible line of vegetation. Or it just simply might mean that water is trapped there because the ground is kind of broken up and that's where the fault is. And so as streams or seasonal floods come down off the mountains, the water collects in this kind of dark band. And that's an indication in the landscape. It's a linear feature in an otherwise convoluted landscape that indicates the presence of something beneath the Earth's surface. That we'll come back to this because that's a very archaeological way of thinking, and it will be relevant. I'll just end by saying that it was quite interesting that a couple months after my article came out in Wired, kind of warning everybody that there was this thing called the Walker Lane, and it was gonna be bigger than the San Andreas. There was a series of huge earthquakes out in the desert that were exactly where the Walker Lane is meant to be taking shape. So these were the big Ridgecrest quakes. There was if I remember correctly, there was like a 6.8 that everybody thought was the big one out there, and then a couple of days later there was a 7.1. And then just hundreds and hundreds of smaller earthquakes that all formed out here along a previously unknown fault region. So it was just kind of interesting to suddenly have everybody reading this Wired article because it kind of explained where the earthquakes came from. And in fact, you can see if you just look at this, you begin to get a sense that it's the root of all pseudoscience is to draw straight lines on maps. But nevertheless, you can see how if the San Andreas kind of deviates over here and goes up, oh God. That the Walker Lane is like a straight shot continuation of the Gulf of California. So in any case, I'll leave it at that. My point is simply that I have many points, but my point is that complex and unstable terrestrial ground conditions make for very an interesting context for architectural speculation and scientific investigation and a sense of sort of philosophical wonder. And we'll come back to that. But I'll just leave it there then for the Walker Lane. We're going to change relatively dramatically here, so hopefully you don't get whiplash. But we're going to jump into my book, A Burglar's Guide to the City, which is a couple examples. And this will be the shortest section of the talk. But I wanted to talk about how thinking about architecture from a different point of view can also mean, it means that burglary is an interesting way in. And I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. Okay, so while writing A Burglar's Guide to the City, many people asked me repeatedly, why I was writing a book about theft or why I was interested in taking other people's property. So let me just say a couple things. So the book does not advocate for burglary. It doesn't recommend it as behavior that you should engage in. So I hope that is clear, both morally and legally. I don't recommend it, and it's not a trade that I think you should go into. But it's also not theft. Something that I think not a lot of people realize is that burglary and theft are not the same thing at all. You can be a thief your entire life and never commit burglary. For example, as a pickpocket or even as a shoplifter. And you can be a burglar your entire life and you can never steal a thing. Burglary is an explicitly architectural crime, because it means simply that you are inside of a structure without permission, and that while you're there, you intend to or have committed a crime. This can be different from state to state, but generally speaking, you're looking at felony kinds of crimes. If you're looking at so you can be a burglar, for example, if you sneak into someone's house without permission and then you forge checks, that makes you a burglar. If you sneak into a building that you don't have permission to be in, and you evade tax, that is also technically speaking burglary. So that might not sound very interesting, but what comes out of that is a intense focus on the division between inside and outside in burglary law and in burglary prosecution. And so the outer limits of architecture and the ability to legally convince a jury or a judge that a building continues beyond its perceived outer bounds is a very abstract conversation in an architectural studio, but it has extreme legal implications in the context of a burglary case or in burglary prosecution. I'll give a couple examples, but a lot of this comes down to something called the close. So the close is just effectively the enclosure. It's an invisible boundary that surrounds legally recognized structures. And it generally speaking follows quote unquote indoor space, but it can also be applied to screened in porches. And it can even be applied to things like convertible cars or like Jeep Wranglers without their tops on that have been left outside parked on the street. So if you've ever wondered why you can't just reach into a convertible and just take, whatever that empty Big Gulp cup that's sitting in the front seat, there is a reason. And not only is that automotive burglary, but because you'd be breaking the close. And so the close then follows effectively what is taken to mean or taken to be like an architect's intent. And so a front door might be open, so there's no physical barrier, but nevertheless, if you go in through that door without permission, you're breaking the close. If a window is open and you reach through that window, your arm has broken the close, and therefore you're considered inside the building from a legal point of view. To give an example of how important it is to define the close and to understand whether or not someone crosses it, there was a really interesting case that I stumbled on while researching the book that was an individual who had gone up to a homeowner who was inside their house and leaned against the window from outside, and their finger crossed the windowsill and was technically inside the house, and they were threatening the homeowner. Threatening them in this manner was considered it was a class of crime that opened this person up to burglary. The fact that their finger was inside the house meant that they'd broken the close, and so this person was charged as a burglar. So in other words, there's a great deal of legal weight in determining it and making sure you know exactly where a building begins and ends. And it would not be hard at all, I think, to find an architect or a kind of like a nefarious architect or a darkly clever lawyer who teamed up to design a structure that made it extremely easy to define people as being inside when they're not, simply so that they can get burglary charges leveled against basically anybody that walks by. So again, a screened-in porch, even if it doesn't have screens on it, if you go up onto it and through, maybe to take a shortcut home. Let's say you might be you have an unregistered handgun, or you're doing something else that is conspiracy to commit a crime, or it's just an illegal act. That 3-second moment when you're inside the screened-in porch, just kind of jumping up and through again, could be enough to get you hit with a burglary charge. So it's a very strange crime, and it has nothing to do with theft. So burglary also opens up this whole kind of folklore about entry and exit. This is a really old infographic that I found as well about how does the burglar get into your house, as if they're some sort of, almost like a species of vermin that finds some way to go from outside to in, looking at windows as if they're doors, or looking at cracks in walls as if they're invitations to enter. And I think that part of this is this kind of realization that burglary reveals a different way of thinking about architecture. The burglar is someone who is going to get into a structure, but they're going to go through the roof. They're going to go up through the floor. They're going to use the sewer system, as we'll see in a few minutes, to get into a building in a way that no one expected. But architects, the very nature of having to produce an infographic like this to try to explain how a burglar gets into your house reveals that they're operating in a conceptual level that is different from how architects think, or even law enforcement officials might think, and certainly different than homeowners. You trust the fact that people are just going to go, or I shouldn't speak for you, but a person generally trusts that a stranger will just use the front door. So if you barricade that front door, you're safe. But the whole challenge of the burglar is that they reveal that They can just come through the window or come through the wall or come through the roof. So how these people get into other people's buildings is part of the nice sort of strange conceptual kind of frisson of exploring burglary in an architectural context. And I'm just going to give a couple examples of how strange it can get in order to show the way in which burglary is a great way to reveal vulnerabilities in the built environment on both an architectural scale, but even on an urban scale. So these are just representative images. These are fire insurance maps. But I'm using these to discuss an example from my book of a man who called himself Jack Daxwin. It was a pseudonym that he was using in order to speak with me without professional consequences. Because according to him, he was a retired burglar. Interestingly, he's now, according to him, a security professional. So he took the skills he learned as a burglar and is now working, I guess you could say, for the other side, helping to protect people from people like him. But so he had a really interesting and strange technique that blew me away when he talked me through it. And he was based in Toronto, and he explained to me that the city's fire code, so the actual regulations determining placement of windows, number of apartments on floors, the location of an emergency escape staircase, which floors are locked in those emergency staircases for purposes of keeping people out, but also making sure that they're used as fire escapes, not just like, people using them all day long and getting in the way of firefighters when they show up. But if you memorize the city's fire code and you begin to really look at it in detail, he was able to use the city's fire code as a kind of targeting system. So he would actually go around the city of Toronto and he could read buildings from outside and develop just from the presence of how many floors they were, how much space they took up on a city block, where he could see that the emergency exit doorway was down in the alley or down on the street. He was able to piece together the internal layout of these buildings and even accurately guess how many apartments there might be per floor, in which case you can guess how wealthy the people might be. If there are 8 apartments on one floor versus 2 apartments, you can begin to guess the kinds of objects that might be in each one. The implication being that the 2 apartments on one floor would be owned by wealthier people and would be filled with nicer things, quote unquote. So he was able actually to take something that ironically was created to protect residents of the city, the fire code. It's there to help you not die in an inferno and to help firefighters so that they too can remain safe. But he was able to take this thing and actually use it against the city and use it as, like I say, this kind of targeting mechanism for choosing which building to hit without ever setting foot in it. He also used real estate sites, floor plans, et cetera, that he found in City Hall, et cetera, et cetera. There are many other ways that he used, but it's just this fire code and the irony of that becoming a burglary tool that I wanted to focus on. And then briefly, I wanted to give this example too, where a really spectacular bank heist happened in Los Angeles, here where I live, in June of 1986. It's still unsolved, and it was committed by individuals who, again, no one knows who they are, or at least no law enforcement professional knows who these people are. But they actually committed the crime by using the city's stormwater network as a method of entry into a bank in the Beverly Hills sort of Sunset Strip section of town. And so the city of Los Angeles, because it goes right up against these very tall mountains, is subject to lots of flash floods. And the city thus built a whole bunch of underground concrete culverts and spillways and stormwater tunnels that will take the water and the rubble that gets washed out of the hills, and it directs it into these networks that then eventually flush it out to a series of ever larger spillways until you get to the ocean. But so these individuals were so good at using those tunnels to actually drive little Suzuki four-wheelers through the tunnels and then set up a kind of a mining operation where they then tunneled into a bank vault from below using the bank's own electrical network, which was a kind of the final insult, and causing all kinds of electrical mayhem in the bank for weeks leading up to the heist. But the FBI actually hypothesized at first that they might actually have just been disgruntled employees of the city's water and power department. That's how well they understood the underground, the underworld of the city. This actually came out when they, not only just in how good they were at getting into the bank the first time, but when they tried to commit the same crime again, but by tunneling into 2 banks simultaneously. Their getaway route, because they were startled in the middle of it, was to drive a massive amount of distance underground from these banks all the way to a kind of exposed riverbank called the Bayona Creek. And if you look at it on a map, you realize just how astonishing that getaway route is. And so were they water and power employees? They were using their knowledge of the city against the city, similar to the fire code example. Another theory was that, or hypothesis was that they were miners, that they had, they were tired of using mining machines and digging up gold and copper for somebody else. And they became more entrepreneurial and opened up a bank crime crew here in Los Angeles, and have never been identified. But so my points here anyway is that if you have a sufficiently granular understanding of the city, from its fire code to its stormwater infrastructure, to, for that matter, it's how a state defines the close in terms of houses, you are already becoming familiar with potential vulnerabilities in that city. And that, again, doesn't mean that I'm advocating that you take advantage of these vulnerabilities and start a burglary crew. It means that you now can become aware that that's how someone else might get into your house or rob your bank vault, or commit acts of high criminality against the city itself. But these vulnerabilities are out there, they're hidden below the surface, and they're often discernible in old documents or archives or things like the very fire code of the city. These are just some photos from the FBI agent who investigated these guys in LA, the tunnel men. So I'll end this section on burglary by just simply saying that, burglars occupy a really interesting imaginative role. There's always, because they give us an excuse to think about how something will be misused or abused. And I think not enough architects think about that. You design a building, but you just trust that someone will come along in the aftermarket economy and they'll put bars on the window or they'll install security cameras. But it's not up to you as the architect to figure out, how to protect the homeowner from nefarious actors who will take advantage of the architecture. It's something that is just handed off to someone else. But burglars allow us, I think, to think about that. Thinking like a burglar means trying to imagine whether or not somebody might come along that alley behind your multi-unit apartment building, or whether or not somebody might climb that tree out front in the new house that you just bought and get up onto the roof and rob the master bedroom. There are any number of imaginative exercises that use burglars to try to figure out how other people might use the metropolis. And I just thought this was a funny example of that. This was, I want to say this is about 110 years old now. But when burglars learned to handle the aeroplane with precision and silence, this was this kind of absurd article actually that was recommending that residents of Manhattan form a rooftop watch organization, and they go up on their roofs at night and they wait for gliders to come in, these silent aeroplanes piloted by burglars who are going to land on the roofs of buildings and rob them from above, as if breaking into like a submarine. So they're going to come down through the roof and they're going to rob apartments all the way down to the ground floor and then come back up and fly away in their airplane. But it's just this idea that burglars have a folkloristic relationship with the city. And in fact, throughout sort of urban folklore, there's always stories of burglars or stories of people breaking into buildings in an interesting way. And I just think that shows again the way in which we should allow ourselves to think about architecture, not because we're going to break into buildings, but because someone else might be thinking that same way and they may be prepared to act on it. Okay, so this is kind of another whiplash-inducing change, but at the same time, I think you'll start noticing some themes are coming up. There's an absurd transition, which is we're about to start talking about airplanes again. So we're left off with burglars flying silent airplanes around. But we had been talking about shadows and the revelation or how to reveal structures in the ground. To go through this, I guess, relatively quickly, this is part of a new project I've undertaken with Graham Foundation funding to look at a turn to geophysical equipment in archaeology. And I'll explain what that means in a second. And that's changing our relationship with the architectural past, but also how we define architectural ruins. So I'm calling it Invisible Cities, Architecture's Geophysical Turn. where the title is obviously a reference to the Calvino novel. So briefly, I'll just start with these. There's an individual named O.G.S. Crawford who owned a private airplane during World War I, and he was just a wealthy landowner who decided to buy himself a plane. And he noticed that when he was taking photographs of the English landscape, that there were these weird shapes in a lot of the fields. And this was the birth of aerial archaeology. There's a very complex relationship between these aerial photographs and military reconnaissance. There's a woman named Kitty Hauser who's written about this extensively, and the next couple slides draw pretty extensively from her work. And I would unhesitatingly recommend turning to her written pieces on this for more information. But this just helps sort of build up to the geophysical stuff to come. And so hidden beneath these fields then are old settlements, old roads, old farmsteads, even entire villages that have been thought to just be gone, erased and lost to the sands of time. But as Hauser in particular points out, a lot of these places never really go away. They just sort of become invisible, and they can be revealed through things like aerial photography because of a really interesting set of circumstances. So one of those is that if there is the presence of a ruined building beneath the surface of the earth, the masonry that it is built from can interfere with the root systems of plants. And so the roots want to go deep and find nourishment, but they can't. And so you'll find a change in the health of vegetation that will reveal lines in the ground that might be the walls of an old villa, or it might be the pavement of an old Roman road. But nevertheless, it's through the plant life seen from above that you're seeing almost a photograph of what lies below. In fact, Hauser herself draws a comparison between the idea of photography and this kind of archaeological revelation, that these fields are kind of developing images of what lies below them, and that there are things hidden in the earth that are almost projected up, and that we can see them if we're there at the right time. And now this comes back to, if you recall, the San Andreas example. Hauser also writes that you have to be there at the right time. Obviously, sunrise and sunset are similarly good because the shadows emerge and you can see ridges and straight lines and in otherwise rolling landscapes. But also even at the time of year. So if you're there when plants have just been put on a farm, on a farmer's land, you're not going to see very much. But if you show up right before harvest in the autumn and you're flying at sunset, you can begin to actually see these kinds of almost like photographs of architecture emerging in the plants. She even points out that certain plants are better than others. So if an archaeologist wanted to team up with an agronomist, you could actually arguably breed certain kinds of plants that are particularly good at indicating what's below them by being very sensitive to root conditions or that kind of thing. But these things are all over the place, but we didn't know that until we could see the signs of them. And aerial photography helped to reveal that. And the idea then is that we become aware of the archaeological presence of ruins without necessarily excavating those ruins. And that'll be a major theme coming up. So what I became really interested in is that, I'm a kind of cheesy in that I love paintings like this. I'm very drawn to romantic pictures of ruin, to archways, to Pyrenean scenes of destruction, to domes collapsing on themselves, to vegetation growing on top of ancient bricks. This is the aesthetic of the ruin. This is the way we represent the past. This is even how we sort of communicate a kind of romantic relationship between the human figure and time itself. But what is happening when the ruins that we're now encountering aren't Pyrenean, they're now magnetic or gravitational? And so part of this new research project is looking at things like this. This is actually not a photograph as such. It is a magnetic survey of an Iron Age fort, and that the straight line you're seeing would be invisible to the naked eye. You wouldn't even know it's there, but it's in the ground in terms of magnetic changes in the soil that indicate disruption or the presence of architectural remains that disrupt a magnetic signal that is measured across the landscape, and then comes up with these kinds of these measurable anomalies that can then be pieced together to see architecture. But so this isn't a thing. It's not an object. It's not a building. Our vocabulary begins to fall short. But nevertheless, it is a signature. it is a remnant. It's a kind of ghost of architecture, and it exists in the soil, so it's physically real. But what is it in relationship to these kinds of things? What does it mean that that's the new face of ruins? What does it mean that beneath our feet are regular earthworks like this Roman villa outside Rome, as it happens? That we would never know is there, but we're able to visualize it. From an art historical point of view, this just fascinates me in terms of what it's doing to the way in which we imagine the past and when we figure it through art, especially when this is the camera, when we tow sensitive electromagnetic equipment behind trailers, or we push it through fields, and we're taking magnetic measurements or maybe gravitational measurements, or we're just using other forms of electromagnetic spectra that are outside human perceptual capabilities. And we're using those to find buildings and cities inside the ground. And we're producing maps like this. That again, this actually uses cesium tomography, I believe. And again, if there's an archaeologist watching this broadcast, they might be having a heart attack right now. But this reveals as well that there's really interesting a connection between medical imaging, the use of tomography, and the architectural past, where it touches on some of the same technologies that can image a broken bone inside your arm or leg, can also find a city beneath the city you're currently in, or a building beneath your current house, without ever excavating. And that's another connection that many people have written about, even before the age of archaeological geophysics. There's a woman named Barbara Maria Stafford, for example, who's an art historian, and she's written about how the rise of medical dissection and the Pyrenean ruin happened in a historically similar time, as a way of imaging what lies below the surface, which I think is quite fascinating. I'll just go through some of this relatively quickly. But so there's an ancient village buried beneath a volcanic eruption, and we can now find it. This is a detecting buried buildings using ground penetrating radar, the same radar that you would use to see if an incoming aircraft is flying over the horizon. You can actually point that down and find cities in the ground. This is actually to try to find a lost boat inside a pyramid. I just think this stuff is fascinating. This is a buried Viking ship in Norway. And then using microgravity inside a church. So gravity is in flux, and it can also reveal the presence of large buried objects. So this was a gravity survey inside a church to see if there was something beneath the church. And again, the metaphors and the narrative possibilities are deeply interesting to me in this case. So to use electromagnetic equipment inside a church in the first place is symbolically interesting. But the idea that there might be things hidden in the walls of a religious site is getting into some really strange and poetic territory. Okay, so that brings me to just a couple final points. I mentioned already, these aren't objects or buildings. It's something different. We need to change our vocabulary. There was a really interesting paper recently by two researchers at UC Berkeley who wrote exactly about this, that our terminology is falling apart. We're talking about something new and we're applying old words to it. And so it's the same with architecture. The idea that there is architecture in the ground doesn't really make any sense by our modern use of that word, when instead what they mean is there is a rectilinear feature in the ground. There is a straight line. There is a square object, or there's a square signature on your monitor. There's multiple layers of sort of detachment here. But there's also something interesting in that they're talking a lot about things like probability and verification. So when you look at the data, and many times it comes back and it looks like that, it looks like this kind of stuff. It's the probability of certain anomalies that might indicate that there is a wall in place, or that there is a road that goes underneath this field. And then it's about verifying the presence of that through other tools, either verifying it through excavation or verifying it through ever finer electromagnetic sensing equipment, such as in this image where there was presumed to be this kind of honeycomb of walls beneath the soil, and then there was the use of GPR to verify the presence of this architecture. But so these individuals, the researchers at UC Berkeley, refer to it as site interiography. So the idea of the writing of the interior, that you have an archaeological site, and if you never excavate it, you can still map what's inside. There's still something in that space. There's still 3D volumetric architectural signatures that can be mapped and known and modeled, but we have to find a new way technically and rhetorically to get at it. And then just the final point I'll make about this entire field here is that a lot of archaeologists are now interested in automating this entire process. You're talking about huge amounts of data. You can have satellite photographs, you can have LiDAR, you can have ground penetrating radar, and you can have magnetic readings, and it's producing terabytes of information. So if you can take all of that and then train a neural network or artificial intelligence to sort through the data and look for regular repeating patterns, then it can begin to identify, okay, that's a tomb, that's a villa, that's a village, and start doing the kind of interpretive work for us. This is just an example of that, where a neural network decided there were no tombs in the top images, but in the bottom ones, those are tombs. So it makes things much faster. You can just cram through or race through massive, huge terabytes full of data. But there becomes a really interesting problem here, an interpretive problem, which is you hear a lot about biases that are built into our algorithms. It's also happening in architecture, where for the time being, and I want to emphasize that I am aware that people are working on this and that it's changing, but for the time being, it's much easier to train a neural network to find an image like this Roman villa that we were looking at earlier. So things like this, it's quite easy for a machine to find that. It's very distinct, it's easy to measure, but it's far less easy for a neural network to recognize, say, an ancient settlements like a campfire in the middle of North America or in the middle of Asia, where and this is where the bias comes in, where a non-Western settlement tradition leaves a different material trace behind. And so I think it's going to be interesting to continue to just watch how that is addressed. So in the same way that, sensors on like hand dryers or automatic dispensers for Purell and that kind of thing are better at recognizing light colored skin than darker colored skin. It's incredibly interesting and tragic that archaeological algorithms might come up against a similar barrier limit, where it's easier to locate the remnants of Western architecture than it is to find non-Western settlement geometries that tend to be more organic, less rectilinear, and use organic forms as well, materials as well. Tree branches, clay, mud, things that dissolve back into the earth unrecognizably, whereas the West use huge blocks of masonry, and thus it is easier to pick up by algorithms. There's a ton that I could continue to go into, but I'm conscious of the fact that I've gone over the time here. So I'll leave it by just saying, I think all three examples that I've tried to show reveal that there are incredibly interesting spatial conditions everywhere, whether it's in the study of plate tectonics, whether it's in various legal codes and how they interact with architecture, or whether it's in the archaeological past itself. And all of these, I think, open up the capacity for in-depth research that I would encourage anybody to leap into. These fields are fascinating. But also, and I hint at this in the description of this talk on the Cranbrook website, a lot of the stuff is very helpful to go out to explore outside of the academic context, in the sense that it's an amazing way to get yourself basically out of the library or archive and out into the field, to explore this stuff from a quote journalistic point of view, to go out and actually meet the people at the front line of this kind of research. To, like, for the burglary book, I actually got to fly around Los Angeles with the LAPD, get to find ways for your research project to open up forms of immersive journalistic experience that really allow you to get outside the traditional readership of an academic community. Not because, let me make sure this is clear, not because that is not a valuable community to have. That is not a judgment on that at all. I simply mean that it opens up new worlds of reference and experience for your own project to undertake. So that's a bit of a rushed conclusion, but I'm happy to talk more about that notion of the kind of immersive journalistic aspect to these sorts of projects. But those are the conceptual stakes. Those are the three things I wanted to discuss, and I will leave it at that. So yeah, if there are some questions and whatnot before we break off, let me know. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Geoff. I don't know if we can see me or not, but
Yeah.
clap. I'm just going to clap and say thank you. And to encourage anyone, while we still have a few minutes, if you're interested in asking a question, just type it into the Q&A and we'll read that. While people might be thinking of that, I was actually really interested in the last point that you made about the kind of shift into maybe a journalistic way of thinking about things, because all along I've always sort of wondered, reading your blog, like how you find your subjects and how, because it seems like there's such a interesting kind of almost X-ray vision of, like, you find the subject and then it leads into this much bigger kind of system of, whether it's system of thinking or technological system or historical system. Like, it's a way of, I've always been fascinated by a way of understanding, like, a really discrete example of or artifact or moment that actually leads you into so much more understanding of, like, how something was made or how we thought about space at that time, or these bigger stories. And so I guess it strikes me that, well, a couple of things you said, like, one, this problem in some ways with words, like that we might not have the right vocabulary for the things that we're seeing. And so if we name things something, then you tend to see it, you're trained to see it in that way. So if we can kind of shift out of that language, then maybe we see it differently. And your last point, I think, hit to that, right? Like, it's maybe not about, as you said, it's not about like anything having to do with the problem with academic or architectural scholarship, but more like, if you get out into that world and think about it, maybe journalistically or otherwise, then you can somehow see different relationships. Do you
Sure.
find that to be a kind of mode of working for yourself, or like, how do you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I do think that part of the quote unquote non-academic approach means that you free yourself up to ask basically like a what if question in terms of new topics or discussions, and trying to ask questions about how this might connect back to architecture and design, or how this might connect to other bits of a research project, which I think also allows you to operate by metaphor or analogy. Oh, this reminds me of this, like this thing that I just read in this book reminded me of this thing from a movie, or from this project I read about last year. And in an academic context, those kinds of metaphors and short circuits and links are effectively meaningless, in the sense that, okay, why you have to justify why you're using this film to compare, or you have to justify how it is that this otherwise random short story or poem or whatever it is that you're using to compare, how it's related to your research project. And so when blogging, you're obviously you're free to make any connections you want to, especially if it's your own platform. But then journalistically too, I think that there would be a tendency in an academic thesis, I think, to go with where the citations require you to go. And so there are certain things that you sort of have to cover because Walter Benjamin wrote about it, or because someone else in the past has theorized this exact thing. Like, this is Adorno territory, or you have to bring in Deleuze at this point. Whereas as a journalist, the thing I like about it is that, in fact, you can stretch those connections without having to constantly cite those kinds of things in the canon.
Yeah.
And it allows you to be more subtle with your references, or it just simply allows you to do first person reporting. I think it's something really interesting about instead of just going back to the library and rereading Horkheimer, I can actually get on the phone and call a burglary detective, or I can call a geologist or an archaeologist, and next thing you know, I'm out there in the field doing something. And for me, again, obviously it's clear that I'm speaking for my own preferences. That's just it's a more exciting way to engage with a research project than to feel like, I'm kind of stuck doing the same kind of citational ballet that I think that academia risks doing. And again, let me just make sure it's totally clear that I'm not trying to denigrate academic research. I'm simply trying to say that, one, it's just a different temperament for me, and that also there are different rewards and opportunities in both fields. And so that's really all I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to again denigrate anyone's work or make it imply that I think academic research is not worth it. That is not at all what I'm suggesting right now.
And it's interesting, there's a question I'll read in a minute, but it's interesting, relative to that, there was something in the Burglars Guide book where you talked about a burglary case in New York City, and the police department kind of handing over this case for you, almost like disinterested, like, if you want this, take it, you know, you can do what you want with it. And it just struck me too, like they wouldn't see it in the way that you would see it. It's you know, it's sometimes we're too close to the thing to see it in that way. So it's kind of trying to get outside of that in order to see this whole other set of relationships.
Yeah.
Possibly. Which this question, I'll read, I'll read, so because it's related. Great research. Thanks for presenting it. I'm wondering why you defined having a journalistic approach and not an anthropological one.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question too. I mean, I think that I absolutely could have used the anthropological lens to talk about some of this stuff. I guess I'd say that often, I mean, without naming names, there are times where I have picked up anthropological books that are an anthropologist of, say, technology, or of interspecies interactions. And it always amazes me when I hit a point in the book, okay, not always, but I often hit a point where it feels like, okay, cool, now here's where we're going to go head out, and, you know, we're going to go out and visit whales, and I mean whales, the species, and see all of the theses that this person has put together about anthropology and the history of sign systems and communications, and what does it mean to be the other and the inhuman, and how do we interact with it. But instead, somehow we always end up back in the citational switchboard of other people who have written about these questions about, you know, whether it's, you know, Deleuze, or whether it's someone theorizing the animal. And there's just something that always strikes me as not intellectually disappointing, but experientially disappointing in a kind of sense that I want to, like, let's take that person who is totally fascinating, this person who I think is an author or a writer who I think is clearly like armed with a lot of intellectual firepower, but get them out of the archive and have them see things. Like, I want to see that person on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic exploring migration zones, or, you know, actually out in the field in a different way. I want to just make sure it's clear. I obviously know that anthropology is as a field is famous for people going out in the field to explore things, but I also just feel like to compare my own work to an anthropological investigation, I don't know. I guess I just feel like I don't necessarily think I deserve that comparison. I just think, you know, anthropologists are extremely trained, very well-suited people for that type of writing and the rhetoric associated with it. And I'm just this guy who gets interested in things and writes about them for a couple of years, and you know, and keeps it in my back pocket. But otherwise, you know, it would feel like a superficial appropriation of the word anthropology to compare my work to it. Having said that, I mean, I have actually, you know, at one point on Building Blog, I joked that my entire approach, you know, I feel like all of this, it's not really writing about architecture, and it's not really writing about landscape. It's writing about spatial anthropology. You know, it's about the ways in which humans spatially interact with the things around them that interest me, because you're talking everything now about, from the Apollo program to archaeology, to residential architecture, to laws and borders. And I think that all of that stuff, you know, from a spatial anthropological point of view, I think opens up those terrains.
Yeah, it's actually, it strikes me, as you say that, it strikes me in some ways that a journalistic approach is maybe not so dissimilar from an architectural approach, in that, you know, we often say architects, we know a little about a lot, because every project is somehow different. Like, there's certain things that are consistent, but you get a new project and you have to kind of dive in and research everything you can about that thing, and then that's maybe a couple of years or a year or a few months, and then you go to the next one. And maybe journalism, not that I've ever done it, is similar in that you dive into something really deeply, but it's not going to last forever, and you're never going to know everything about it, right? It's more about kind of piecing together that story for that moment in some ways.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, and I feel like also, you know, I guess to use the journalistic metaphor again, I think that what's important about that too is just that, I mean, one of the things that I think can be limiting in an academic context is the notion that only other academics are going to be interested in your work. You know, that there's like the 6 other people in anthropology who write about this particular field are going to be the ones that will read your work. But I find actually that's not true at all. I think that there are just an immeasurably huge audience of people that are fascinated by this stuff. And I think writing for that larger audience, again, is not a way doesn't denigrate our academic research, but in fact is like me almost saying the opposite. This stuff is so interesting that it's a shame to only limit it to, peer-reviewed university publications that are $50 per issue, when instead there's a way to journalistically cover things and bring interesting material out to a wider audience and make the world more interesting, frankly. I think that one of the reasons why I like that sort of approach is that you're taking things and selfishly, it's like, I want more people to do that because I want I want people to talk about that stuff on Twitter rather than, whatever other meaningless absurdity is the trending topic of the day. What if we all took our stuff and we actually tried to find a way to find a bigger audience for it? It's not a popularity contest. It's about changing the world and changing the conversation and making people focus on more exciting and interesting things.
Mm-hmm. And the other side of that to me too is knowing about that, but then also how it changes your thinking about what you do every day, or in architecture, like how you can sort of retrain yourself to think about kind of the underworlds that exist or previously existed, or in any way how that shapes how you think about design, like how it somehow becomes enacted in a different way. And so I was curious about the student work or some of the themes that might have come up to think about the future of something like a completely fluid yet feeling like it's stable groundscape or landscape. I mean, what were some of the kind of themes that came out through the student work that you did in that San Andreas Fault studio?
Yeah, it was funny. I mean, there were a couple aspects to it that were built into the project. So on the first bit of the semester was actually geared toward one of the themes that I discussed in the talk, which was actually consciously and explicitly design an instrument for capturing and revealing tectonic movement, and then show how it would work. And so the students actually physically modeled, and in some cases these were actual like functioning devices that would actually reveal tectonic movements. So in some cases there was one that was quite interesting, which was a gigantic series of vertical shafts with bells in them, and then it was the length of the cable that would hold the bell that would determine whether or not it would toll when there was a small earthquake. And so eventually there was the super bell that would go off if it was like a 9.0 or above, where you would really know, like, that something very, very terrible is happening, when the deep bells begin to toll inside the earth. But there were other things that were more like small kind of almost like pseudo-scientific instruments that could be attached to the landscape and reveal the way that the earth was changing. And then in terms of the project themselves, there was a lot of interesting ways of incorporating these kinds of tectonic shifts from one plate to another just into the architecture of the visitor center itself, so that you could get a sense of where you were by just the architecture of the visitor center, where there might be abrupt disjunctions from one wing to the next. You can imagine that some of these looked a little bit sort of, I've already referenced this guy, but they looked a little bit like Peter Eisenman early diagrams, where you've got effectively like two buildings mashed together. But so it was interesting to explore that kind of thing. It was also interesting from one point of view, because I still think about this, was just one student who just did not think that the San Andreas Fault landscape was spectacular at all. and was just like, was just looking at it and just could not figure out what to do, and was like, I don't think that this landscape is spectacular, but first of all, I mean, there was an interesting challenge, which was like, you're the one who chose that site. Like you could have chose a different site along the San Andreas that you did think was spectacular. But also I just think the lesson there is actually that, I mean, as an architect, a practicing architect, you are inevitably going to have clients who say, oh, I just inherited this beautiful piece of land, or I just bought my dream piece of land. It's an hour outside the city and I want you to design the house. And then you drive out there and you're like, this is not a dream piece of land. Like it doesn't inspire you at all. Yeah. But your job is to understand what the client is looking for and find a way to highlight that. So I thought that was also just interesting. And I think about that a lot, because the student just didn't want to find anything interesting in the San Andreas Fault. So I feel bad, but it was a teachable moment.
Yeah, that's right.
So there was a lot of that kind of stuff, but there were about, I want to say, I can't remember, 11 or 12 students. And so there were maybe more, but there were I mean, some of them were some of the projects were more like tower kind of structures on stilts that would reveal through both movement and also the vertical view of the landscape that they were built over. And so yeah, it was fun. There was a lot of cool stuff. It's actually a class I'd love to teach again someday. It was really interesting.
Yeah, no, it sounds fascinating. Well, I think we might call it there, because we,
Sure.
those of you who are in the class, we have the pleasure of having Geoff join us in a smaller group discussion with our architecture studio next. So just being conscious of time when we finish the questions. So we'll move over to that space next. So
Okay, sure.
We'll see you over there in a few minutes, take a break, and we'll regroup. But thanks to everyone else who joined us. Thanks, Geoff, for joining us. It was really fascinating talk. Really nice to have you with us.
Great. Yeah, thanks for attending. And I will see the students in the other room.
Okay.